do so. You're going to need to be in Mark chapter 8 this morning in your Bible. We've been talking about what it means to be a Christian. We've said that being a Christian means someone who's born again. Someone who's been made new spiritually. They've been cleansed of sin, filled with the Spirit of God. We've said that a Christian is a believer, someone who believes in and confesses Jesus as the resurrected Lord of glory. And today what we're going to talk about is what it means to be a follower of Christ. See, all of these different labels help fill out the picture of what it means to be a Christian, to be born again, to be a believer, to be a follower of Christ. Next week, we're going to talk about what it means to be a saint. All of these things help fill out the picture of what it means to be a Christian. It's not one or two of these things, it's all of them. A person who's a Christian is not only born again, they're not only a believer, they're not only followers of Christ, they're saints. And all of these things, we need to understand all of these to really get a good picture of what we mean when we talk about being a Christian. Today in Mark 8:34 through 38, we're going to try to understand what it means to be a follower of Christ. Please stand for the reading of God's holy word. And he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? What will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Please be seated. You're not a Christian just because you say you are. You're not a Christian just because you profess to be a Christian. What we're going to learn today is a Christian is someone who selflessly follows Jesus. That's a Christian. A profession saying you're a believer by itself is no evidence that you are a Christian. A Christian follows Jesus. You are a follower if you are a Christian. Now, I need to give you the context so we'll understand these verses. And I had Corey read some verses, and those verses really are the context. Jesus has just explained to his disciples that he's going to be arrested and mistreated and beaten and crucified and rise again. And Peter does something that's almost impossible to imagine. He rebukes the Lord. Now, not Jesus, this whole dying stuff, you're not going to be crucified. This is not going to happen. And Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan, because you don't have your mind on the interests of God, but only on the interests of man." You see in the verses we just read, verses 34 to 38, this is essentially what Jesus is saying. Look, Peter, I have to do my Father's will. I have to follow, even if it costs me my life. And by the way, so do you. If you're going to be a Christian, you have to follow at the cost of your life the same way that Jesus had to obey the Father at the cost of his life. My goal today is very simple. I want you to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and I want to try to persuade you to actually follow Christ. There are two parts to this message. Here's the first. To be a Christian, you must follow Jesus, very simply. Verse 34. He summoned the crowd with his disciples, said to them, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow I want to begin with the idea of follow. If anyone wishes to come after me, he must follow. Now, what does that mean? He means if you're going to join up with me, if you're going to be part of my kingdom. You see, the disciples then were thinking in terms of the kingdom. Jesus has come to usher in the promised kingdom of God. They're coming with him. They're joining up with him to be part of that kingdom. For you and I, it means if we want to be Christian, if we want to associate with Jesus, if we want to be one of his, we must follow Jesus. Now, I want to try to flesh out for you what does it mean to follow Jesus. I want to try to get as practical as I can because I want you to get a clear picture of what it actually means and looks like to follow Jesus. And so I have 3 words that I'm going to give you to help you understand what it means to follow Jesus. Here's the first one. It's the word command. To follow Jesus means to understand and obey his commands, his teachings. We do what he tells us to do. And there are positive teachings and negative teachings. Let me give you an example. Positively, there are things that we are supposed to do actively. Think about the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of Jesus. Think about the principle he gives there for laying up treasure in heaven. He says, look, don't lay up treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. Lay up your treasure in heaven, not on earth. Because in heaven there are no moths or rust to destroy. Nobody's going to steal it. It's secure. And what he's teaching us is that Christians invest in eternity. We don't spend our lives investing in earthly things that perish, spoil, and fade, but we as believers are to prioritize heaven, and we invest in things that give eternal dividends, that pay eternal rewards. To follow Christ means we obey those commands. Here's another teaching from the Sermon on the Mount. Think about the Lord's Prayer. This isn't just something given to us to recite. It's given to us to teach us to pray. So as a Christian, to follow Jesus means that I give myself to learning how to model my prayer after the Lord's Prayer. How does the Lord's Prayer teach me about prayer? What does it say to me about what I should be praying, what I shouldn't be praying? You see, to follow Jesus means positively we're looking at the things he teaches and we're acting on them. But his commands also sometimes have a negative aspect. That means they're not just things we do, but they're things we stop doing because we follow Jesus. One of the things that I'm convinced none of us probably gives enough effort to is fighting sin. It is your responsibility as a Christian to kill the remnants of sin left in your life. Actively to go to war against the sin that remains in you. Things like greed. Boy, you get into somebody's wallet. You know, right? They get sensitive when you start getting into their wallet. Listen, if you have a problem with being stingy and being greedy, then that's something you ought to work on. That's something you ought to take pains and efforts to kill that in your life. You make some rules for yourself. Get some people to help you be accountable. Start giving away some stuff. Pray for God to conquer the greed in your heart. Listen, following Jesus means you're trying to rid yourself of the sin that he condemns. A lot of men have issues with lust, whether they'll admit it or not. It's just statistically the fact. This is something men struggle with. Well, our job as Christians is we go to war against it. We try to eliminate the things that we know are going to be temptation. Turn the TV off, right? If that's what it takes. Get off of Facebook. Whatever you have to do to fight those temptations. You go to war against it. When your mind begins to go places it shouldn't, you turn to prayer. Turn to the promises of Scripture. You attack that sin, put it to death. Listen, to be a Christian means we have to pattern our lives after the commands of Jesus. Positively, that means doing the things he tells us to do. Negatively, that means ridding ourselves of the sin that has no business being in the life of a Christian. There's a second word. Not only does following Jesus mean obeying his commands, here's another word, character. Following Jesus is modeling his character. In other words, we seek to follow his example in all of life. John chapter 13, Jesus does something that to me is astounding. Next to the cross, this is to me the most astounding thing he ever did. He washed the feet of his disciples, even Judas. He performed a task that even Hebrew slaves weren't allowed to do. You had to get Gentile slaves to wash feet. You couldn't let Hebrews do it. Yet the Lord of glory stoops and dons himself with a towel and washes the feet of these men. And in verses 14 through 16, what Jesus said is, I have done this to you as an example for you to do it to one another. See, as a Christian, to follow Jesus means you seek to follow the example he gives. In that case, the example is humbly, sacrificially serving one another. I humble myself in order to serve others. Another example that we want to imitate would be Jesus in Luke chapter 19. That's the story you learned in Sunday school in VBS, the story of Jesus with Zacchaeus. You remember the wee little man who climbed up the sycamore tree, which really wasn't a sycamore tree? What's the example there? You see, Zacchaeus was an outcast. Everybody hated Zacchaeus. He was considered a traitor to his people, the Jews, and nobody liked Zacchaeus. But he's the first one Jesus targeted when he went into town. What's that teach us? It teaches that Jesus is willing to touch the untouchables. And that's not just a neat story, it's to teach you and I. As Christians, we model our lives after his example. We touch the untouchables. We're willing to reach out to those that society has rejected and ridiculed. We follow his commands. We imitate his character. Here's another word to help you understand what it means to follow. Cause. His cause. In other words, we adopt his priorities. Back in verse 33 of this chapter, Jesus said to Peter, you're not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. That's a rebuke. What he's saying is you should be setting your mind on God's interests, because that's what Jesus had done. See, to adopt his cause, to follow Jesus means his interests become our interests. His priority becomes my priority. What he's all about becomes what I'm all about. In John chapter 4, verse 34, you may remember the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. Well, he blows this woman's mind by essentially telling her what her past has been like. His disciples have been gone to buy food. They come back. They try to give him some food. He doesn't seem to want any. And they said, is somebody giving him something to eat? And in verse 34, he said, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and accomplish his work. What sustains me, what feeds me, what I live for is to do the will of God. That's the stance of a follower of Christ. We live to do his bidding. You remember what he told Peter and James and John when they were fishing and he called them away from their boats and their nets? Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. In other words, when you follow me, you get a new purpose in life. You get a new set of priorities. You get a whole new perspective. You see, following Jesus means that the cause of Christ becomes my cause. What Jesus is most interested in is what I am most interested in. His most important pursuit becomes my most important pursuit. And I need you to tell you, these three things, his commands, his character, his cause, they overlap. Let me tell you what I mean. When you follow his commands, you are imitating his character. You are pursuing his cause. When you pursue his cause, you are following his commands. You are imitating his character. These three overlap greatly. I give them to you separately to help you get a good picture, but they overlap greatly. All of these give a picture of what it looks like to follow Jesus. And this is the thought I need you to get stuck in your mind here. Following is not passive. Following is not passive. Just accepting Jesus, whatever that means, does not make you a follower. Just professing to be a Christian does not make you a follower of Christ. What makes you a follower of Christ? Following makes you a follower. It's active. It's not passive. When I was in high school, girls would sometimes wear their boyfriend's football jersey to school. Let me ask you a question. Does wearing that jersey make her a member of the football team? No. You know what makes you a member of the football team? Running wind sprints in April when it's 100 degrees outside with 100% South Louisiana humidity. That makes you a member of the football team. Doing two-a-days at the end of July and early August. Doing calisthenics and running laps and learning the plays and taking the hits. Getting dressed out on Friday night and driving 2 hours to get beat 47-0. Coming back broken and bruised and doing it all again. That makes you a member of the football team. Not wearing the jersey. Wearing your Christian t-shirt and your Christian bracelet and saying you're a Christian does not make you a Christian. Following makes you a Christian. Christians are followers. Following is active. It means you seek daily in the power of the Spirit to become more like Jesus and less like the sinful world around you. Can I make it real simple? Following is you striving daily in the power of his Spirit to become more like Jesus every day and sin less every day. That make sense? Following is seeking daily to promote the Christian faith with our words, with our actions, with our resources. We're trying to be like Christ in our character. We're trying to promote his cause with our life. That's what following Jesus looks like. It's something we do actively. And if you want to be a Christian, following Jesus is required. It's not optional. If any man wants to come after me, he must follow me. There's a requirement. And if you're going to follow Jesus, there's another requirement. To follow Jesus, you must be selfless. You must be selfless. What does that mean? Well, three things I want to show you. First, notice this. Verse 34, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself. Denying yourself doesn't mean denying yourself things. It's not, I'm going to give up chocolate for Jesus. Or I'm going to give up Netflix for Jesus. Denying self is not denying things. It's denying self itself. It's not Corey's going to deny dessert for Jesus. It's Corey's going to deny Corey for Jesus. That's what it means to deny self. It means You are going to refuse to be guided by your own interests. Back to verse 33, he rebuked Peter, you're being guided by man's interest, not God's. To deny self means I refuse to be guided by my own desire, my own will, my own interests. It means you're going to pursue Christ's will and his desires above your own. You are surrendering control of your life, not part of it, but all of it. This is your life, Jesus, to do with as you please. That's what it means to deny self. It is literally means to say no to self. It's the same word, deny, that's used to describe Peter when Peter denied Jesus 3 times the night before he was crucified. You remember how strongly Peter denied Jesus? Very strongly, even to the point of cursing, which doesn't mean saying curse words. It means calling down a curse on himself. May God strike me dead if I know this man. Strongly. Well, to deny self means just as strongly as that, you say no to self. When self wants to decide what you're going to do with your life, you say no, self. When self wants to allow its desires to control things, he call the shots, you're going to say, no, self, you're not going to have your way. I'm going to follow Jesus. The greatest example of this is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane as he's praying, and in his flesh, he does not want to go. Jesus was human, and in his humanity, he did not want to go to the cross. If there's any way we can do this some other way, Father, nevertheless, not my will, but thine. That's what it means to deny self. God, this is what I want, but what I want's not what's important. It's what you want. Preacher, does that mean I can't be a veterinarian if I want to? No. It may very well be that God's desire is for you to be a veterinarian. What it means is your will has to be submitted to his, no matter what that means. You have to deny self. Here's something else. You have to take up your cross. If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself. He must take up his cross. I need to clear something up real quick. All of my life I've heard people say things like, well, this is just my cross to bear. Somebody has a handicap and they're like, this is my cross to bear. You got a nagging mother-in-law. Well, this is just my cross to bear, whatever. Listen to me. Please don't reduce the cross to some inconvenience in your life. You wear a cross around your neck. You know what that's the equivalent of? That's the equivalent of wearing the symbol of an electric chair around your neck. A cross is only one thing. It's only ever been one thing. It is an instrument of execution. It is an instrument of death. To tell you that you must take up your cross if you want to follow Jesus does not mean you have to be willing to be inconvenienced. It means you have to be willing to die. And the people who stood by and heard Jesus say this the first time, that's exactly what it meant for them. It meant death for every single one. You can't follow Jesus if you aren't willing to follow him to the point of losing your life. Any cost. To take up your cross means to embrace the possibility of a literal death. I was reading a news article just this week, just in the past 5 days. In Nigeria, Muslims executed 5 men for trying to convert other Muslims to Christianity. They had them, the picture had the Christian men were on their knees, blindfolded. Behind each one of them stood a Islamic soldier with a rifle, and they executed all 5 of them for simply evangelizing. You have to be willing to go as far as you have to go in following Christ, even if it means your death. Now, taking up your cross would also involve lesser suffering. Obviously, if you're willing to die for Christ, you're willing to endure less than death. But please don't reduce taking up your cross to just being willing to patiently suffer hardship. That's not what it means. It's not what it means. It means you have to be willing to give everything. I understand now where I said to follow Jesus, you must be selfless. You have to deny self, be even willing to die. You have to be willing to let go of self. There's one more thing I want to point out to you in verse 38. Because there's some people who, say, well, I understand if out in the world I follow Christ, I'm going to have ridicule and hardship. But I tell you what I'll do. I'll just keep my faith more private to avoid some of those issues. Verse 38, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. There is no such thing as privately following Jesus. I'll say that again. There is no such thing as privately following Jesus. Well, I'm going to be a Christian. I'm just not going to let all my friends know. It doesn't work like that. I'm going to try to follow Christ, but I'm just not going to let my coworkers know. It doesn't work like that. You can't follow Jesus unless you're willing to do it publicly. You have to be selfless. Now maybe you'll understand. Look at verse 35. Maybe you'll understand now why in verse 35 Jesus refers to following him as losing your life. You see that? Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. There he associates following him with losing your life. Maybe now you understand why he says that. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Follow publicly. Privately following is not an option. It's losing your life. It means I willingly surrender this earthly life to Jesus to do with me as he pleases, no matter what that means. This life, every single aspect of it is his. Now maybe you can understand why in Galatians 2:20 Paul said, I am crucified with Christ. I no longer live. Jesus now lives in me. This life has been given to Christ. The old life is dead and gone. Self is dead and gone, and this life now belongs to Jesus. Now here's the question. You have to be selfless to follow Jesus, willing to deny self, willing to die, willing to be publicly ridiculed. Why in the world would anybody do that? For heaven's sake. Verse 35. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. What exactly does that mean? Let me give you another verse, John 12:25. He who loves his life loses it, and he who hates his life in this world will keep it to life eternal. In other words, if you're willing to let go of this life, turn your back on self and follow Jesus. Yes, you're sacrificing your present life. You're sacrificing the right to do whatever you want to with your life, to live your life any way you want to. You're sacrificing this present life in order to serve Jesus, but what you get in return is eternal life. You sacrifice a life that is temporary for a life that is eternal. That's a pretty good deal. You sacrifice a life where joys are going to be mixed with pain for a life where there'll be no more pain, only joy. You sacrifice a life with ups and downs for a life where there's only ups. You sacrifice a life that you can't keep to gain a life that you can't lose. But to refuse to sacrifice your life in this life, to refuse to do what verse 35 called losing your life, to refuse to do that is to forfeit your soul for all eternity. Whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. In other words, if you insist on having your life now, living it the way you want, you're going to dictate, you're not going to follow Jesus, you're going to let self run the show, you're going to save your life now, then you will lose life eternal. Verse 36 calls it forfeiting your soul. Okay, you can have life. You can have this life the way you want it. You forfeit your soul. By the way, in Greek, soul and life are the same word. You save your life now, but you sacrifice your life eternal. And that's why the two verses 36 and 37 are so powerful. What do you profit if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? So what if you become Bill Gates and Steve Jobs all rolled to one and you got everything your heart could possibly desire? You're going to go to a casket and leave it all and go to hell. What have you gained? What would a man give in exchange for soul? What price would be high enough for you to let somebody have your eternal soul? Hey, if you'll give me this, I'll give you my soul. What would you take in exchange for heaven? $1 million? $100 million? $1 billion? Would you exchange your eternal soul for $1 billion? You are the supreme, grandest fool of them all. You know what the message of verse 36 and 37 is? The pursuit and preservation of self is senseless. The pursuit and preservation of self is senseless. It makes no sense for you to spend your life pursuing what self wants and trying to preserve what self wants. It makes no sense, because to do that is to forfeit your soul. Listen, what's the point? If you're going to follow Jesus, you have to be selfless. A Christian is someone who selflessly follows Jesus. Now, let me ask you a question. Are you following Christ? Actively. Are you seeking daily to obey his commands, to imitate his character, to advance his cause? Are you actively living your Christian life that way? Are you actively following? Or are you passive? Well, I accepted Christ, but other than that, I'm really passive. I'm not really doing anything to actively follow, but I did accept Christ. Listen, accepting Christ doesn't make you a follower. Only following makes you a follower. Can I tell you something? It's not what you do that makes you a Christian. But you can't be a Christian without doing anything. God's going to save you by his grace through your faith, and it ain't going to have nothing to do with what you do. But when you get saved, you will do something. Well, preacher, that ain't what I've been taught all my life. Well, you've been taught wrong. Jesus said, if any man would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. That ain't my words. That's the Bible. Any man, any person. Nobody gets around it. Heaven is for those who follow Jesus. You remember when Jesus was with a room full of people and he was teaching, and some people came up to him and said, your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you. You remember what he said? He said, who is my mother and sister and brother? It is those who do the will of my Father. Are you active, following Jesus actively, or are you just passive? And here's the thing. I need you to don't lose sight of this. We don't help people when we tell them that following Jesus is not hard, because if you're actually really following in this world, it's hard. But the pain, the difficulty, the hardship, suffering, persecution, whatever it may cost, listen, it can't even be compared to the wonder and beauty and joy and pleasure of what waits us. We don't follow Christ for what we gain here and now. We follow him for what we gain in the hereafter. That's why Paul said, if in this life only we have hope, we're of all men most miserable. What we gain is so much better than what you might sacrifice to follow Jesus. You can't lose sight of that. What makes it worth it is the priceless gift of eternal life. If you have never committed yourself to follow Christ in the way that I've been describing, Christ calls you today, come, follow me. That's the invitation Christ gives to everyone in the Bible. Read the New Testament. His invitation is, come, follow me. His invitation to the first disciples was, come, follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. His invitation to the rich young ruler, sell everything you have and come and follow me. That's always his invitation. Come and follow me. I'm not going to ask you, are you a Christian? I'm going to ask you, are you following Jesus? Bow your heads. Today, I would love nothing more. I'm going to ask Corey to come to the piano and play I Have Decided to Follow Jesus.